everybody. Please go ahead and grab your seats. Welcome to Vermont Law School. My name is David Mears. I am the Associate Dean of the Environmental Law Programs here at the Law School, and it is a great pleasure to have you all here. And I can tell you that we would have had, we have all the law students in the audience. I see at least 3 or 4. Raise your hand. They deserve extra credit. There's some in the back. This is actually the first day of their spring break. So we didn't time this exactly right for student participation, but I'm so happy that we have such a wonderful crowd here tonight. When Chris Woods, who you'll meet in a moment, first approached me about this idea, I was so excited because there's a group of us in this area who have been talking about ways that we can forge a relationship between the law school and the environmental programs, in particular at the law school, and the arts community in the Upper Valley, and frankly, in Vermont and nationally. And we're at a point in time where the intersection between art and social action and climate change and environmental protection and the ability to turn that into action through law and policy, there has never been a more important time for us to be having this kind of exchange, this kind of interaction in which we look for that moment where we find what we have in common and begin to build what a number of you have mentioned to me tonight, which is it smells like there's something in the air, maybe just the beginning, that sweet smell of spring, that sweet smell of a social movement. That is what it's going to take to really transform the way that we live together on this land. So I'm so pleased and happy to have this group of amazing artists with us today. And I'll turn it over to Todd Tyson, who's the program director with a local radio station, to take it from here. But thank you again for coming.
Thank you very much, David, and thanks to Chris Wood standing in the back for being sort of the glue that has brought this all together. I want to acknowledge the co-sponsors of this afternoon's program, and they include, of course, the Vermont Law School and the New Economy Law Center, BAIL, which of course stands for Building a Local Economy, and I recognize a number of people that were over at the art opening of Robert Shetterly, and you'll be hearing more from Robert here in just a moment. And also want to thank an organization that another guest founded a number of years ago, 350 Vermont, sponsoring this afternoon, and also our little radio station. And since I'm a radio person, uh-oh. Becca, this maybe isn't going where it's supposed to go. Didn't go to the music school. I'm going to be playing this piece of music. See if you recognize the voice that's on it. This is from a fellow named Seth Bernard. Go ahead and hit play on that. Uh-oh, that's the wrong cut. That's all right. I'll just tell you that this happens in community radio all the time. You just need to talk to Vern Barkley. Vern will set you straight. Vern, are you watching? Get the book. You'll find out who Vern Barkley is. Anyway, the piece of music that I was trying to play is called 21st Century Blues, and it samples one of Bill McKibben's speeches. Now, Bill, I don't know if actually the lawyers may have changed that. Did you give permission to have your voice used in that piece of music by Seth Bernard? He's nodding his head. Okay, we're okay. No, lawyers don't have to get ramped up. The structure of today's afternoon is going to go like this. First of all, you're all going to get a chance to ask questions of our 3 guests today, but that will happen after they all give their 20-minute presentations. We're going to start with Robert in just a moment. He'll be followed by Bill and then followed by Sherri Mitchell. So that's the way that's going to go. We're going to have roving mics. In fact, I don't know, Chris, do we have someone who's going to do the roving mic part when we get to that part? So that's kind of the deal there. I will basically give just a brief background in reverse order. It's so great to have Sherri Mitchell from the Penobscot tribe in Maine with us again. She was at a great conference that was held here last summer. She is a well-known attorney, human rights and indigenous peoples activist, has traveled the globe, and she has her book with her today that she's going to be reading from. She was recognized over there by one of Robert's portraits, and I'm just looking for the name of the book, and it's called Sacred Instructions, Indigenous Wisdom for Living Spirit-Based Change. And I'm also very happy, I spoke with her colleague, Rivera's son, or actually traded emails. Rivera and Sherri have produced a show, and in case you don't know this, Sherri, Rivera says you guys are going to get that podcast up and running again later this year to add to your burden that you are. You did not. Anyway, the name of the show, we're hoping to carry it on WFVR, is called Love and Revolution Radio, which focuses on real-life stories, heart-based activism, and revolutionary spiritual change. We're looking forward to hearing from Sherri today. Bill McKibben, how many of you have heard Bill McKibben speak in the past? Yeah, I was going to say, we have a pretty full room. Of course, very familiar with so many great books. Of course, the one that put him on the map quite a while ago now, The End of Nature, Deep Economy, Oil and Honey, Earth, which is spelled pretty differently when I've seen it in the bookstores. And then, of course, Radio Free Vermont, and Bill will be reading excerpts from that. And of course, he is a special, I think it's the Schumann professor, I forget the middle part, but over at Middlebury College, and he lives in Ripton. Robert Shetterly, great portrait painter, activist, has been involved in civil rights. He's been involved in community radio. He's just telling me that he is a supporter of WERU radio in Maine. He lives in Brooksville, graduated from Harvard back in 1969, got very active, moved to Maine, has traveled around, has collected a number of important awards, has gotten fellowships to teach at various universities around the country, and he is going to give you a presentation. I think the favorite thing that I saw is he used to do the caricatures or drawings for a great paper that I don't think is anymore, Journalism Under Fire, the Maine Times, which I used to read. So I'm going to introduce Robert first. Let's have a warm round of applause for Robert Shetterly from Brooksville, Maine.
Thank you. Thank you. What a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Todd. Is this talking too close to it? Where are Chris and Sylvie back there? First, I want to thank them for making this happen and hosting us so graciously and becoming great new friends. I want to thank these two amazing people for being here tonight. And trying their hardest to look like their paintings. I think you know, done. It's so nice of you to make that effort. I want to single out, where is Nancy Doda? There's Nancy Doda. I don't know how many of you know Nancy. She's one of this country's great educators. She integrated the Americans Who Tell the Truth education project with the Common Core so that it would fit into a lot of schools without teachers saying, oh, we can't teach this because it doesn't, we can't meet the standards. Anyway, she made that happen. And she is, in an ongoing way, is working with our educational work. And anyway, thank you all. It's great to meet so many of you tonight. I think I'll just talk a few minutes about where this project came from. And because this was not my intention to paint portraits. I'm a self-taught artist. I developed a career as a surrealist. The last thing in the world I thought I'd ever do was paint portraits, especially with words on them, didactic paintings. It's like, never do that. In the, right after 9/11, when the run-up to the Iraq War, I was just going berserk, as that was, it's not so much. As Howard Zinn used to say, all governments lie. Well, all governments do lie, that doesn't come as a surprise. what really hurt was that our media did nothing to really stop it. Instead, they cheerleaded for it. And that was the thing that enabled the Iraq War to happen. And of course, it's still going on, you know, how are we ever going to end this thing? Nobody ever tells the truth about what happened. And that's the thing that, as that was proceeding, and I was getting so full of anger and then, you know, potential grief for all the victims that were going to be of this war that continue to pile up. You know, I thought, what can I do? You know, what can I do this to, one, to relieve myself of some of this angst, and two, to, it's not like I would have a voice necessarily, but at least I wouldn't feel so alienated from this country or actually separated from myself. And I remembered this, and I'm sure a lot of you know this story, the great pacifist of the early or the middle of the 20th century, A.J. Musty. You know, he used to, at the beginning of the Vietnam War, stand, you know, in front of the White House every single night with a candle, one guy with a candle. And one night he's out there in the rain, and this reporter comes up and said, "Mr. Musty, you know, what are you doing out here? Do you really think with your little candle in the rain, you're going to change the policy of this country?" And he said, no, I don't think I'm going to change this country at all. I'm just making sure the country won't change me. And, you know, for me, that this, painting these portraits of people like Bill and Sherri, and now over 230 other people, has, I think, helped save me from feeling like the country was changing me. You know, I think if a country has, you know, any right to claim its own nobility, you know, there are a lot of things that we, you know, use often as metrics for, or at least are used by politicians and other people to talk about how wonderful we are. And a lot of them have to do with economy. But, you know, what really is the nobility of the country are the people who insist that you live up to your own ideals and then make that happen. And to me, that's kind of the people that I've been painting, you know, and that's what this has been about. Who are those people, you know, who take the language seriously enough to base their lives on it and then try to make it real for other people. And of course, most often, the people who do that are the marginalized people themselves, the people who've been left out, who say, you know, what about me? Since we're in a law school, I want to say a couple things about the law. You know, as I may have said, but I will say, I get the opportunity because of the paintings, which is an interesting thing in itself, because often I get invited to a lot of places that I know don't probably agree with my politics, at least not a lot of it. But because of the art, I get in the door. They invite the collection to come, and then they invite me to speak. And it's as though the art itself has authenticated a kind of message that a lot of people don't necessarily agree with, but when they see these paintings, they say, well, okay, we can deal with this. And well, there's a dialogue then that takes place. And that, to me, is really exciting. But one of the things you notice in schools is that about things in our history where there's never accountability, you know, they can't be taught. For instance, I go into a lot of schools when I start to talk about how I started this project about the Iraq War, and I say, well, you know, these were crimes. This wasn't, as is sometimes said in our media, that, well, this is a mistake. The Iraq War was a mistake. Well, it wasn't a mistake. You know, it was very intentional. And it was by our own laws and the Nuremberg Principles and the Geneva Conventions was, you know, the biggest crime that a country can commit. We hung Nazis for preemptive war. And here we were doing it. But if there is no accountability for it, it becomes something that is somebody's opinion. And so, you know, I'll say, well, you know, we committed this crime. We did this thing. What are you talking about? You know, they've never heard that there was any crime. And so many of the things that, you know, don't make it into our history books and aren't being taught in our schools, you know, fall into that category. Well, we never really want to hold anybody accountable. You know, when Obama came into office, and one of the first things he says was, we're not going to prosecute anybody from the Bush administration. We're going to look, as he said, forward, not back. This is a constitutional lawyer saying you're not going to use the law to do what the law does, which is look back so we can look forward. You have then, given carte blanche to a crime. And, the old saw about, well, if you, don't learn your history, you're doomed to repeat it. Actually, the mechanism that drives this kind of thing is purposely, not learning your history so you can repeat it. When there is no accountability, the history can be repeated, again and again and again. And unfortunately, that's what we see. What we also see, thank goodness, is, the people like this community who both locally and nationally, stand up and say, we're not going to live like this. If the country isn't going to change, we're going to change. And you change your communities. You change the way you change the way to live, the way you use energy, the way you use water, the way you grow your food, the way you educate your children. You start changing those things, and then you take part in these big efforts to change, things on a bigger scale. That's what's happening now, and it's so exciting. The question is, of course, is the time. Do we have time to make the kind of changes that really need to happen? Let me just single out a couple of people, if I can, here, make this work. Too many portraits here. And now I don't even have any glasses.
Can we dim the lights?
Yeah. That's not done.
No, okay.
That's all right. That's Thoreau. He was one of the very, very first portraits I painted. I mean, when I started, I painted, my first portrait was Walt Whitman, and Thoreau, Frederick Douglass, Mother Jones, Susan B. Anthony, Jane Addams, all these 19th century figures. And actually, in terms of putting quotes on pictures, his may have been the hardest. I had a list of 360 quotes. I mean, the guy couldn't open his mouth, right, without saying, oh, wow. Let's put that on there. But anyway, the quote that I put on there seemed particularly important for this moment. He said, the law will never keep men free. It is men who have got to keep the law free. So important, and such a basic idea. We hide behind this notion all the time, well, this is the law says this. And as we all know that, if you're a guilty rich person in this country, you have a much better chance in our legal system than if you're a poor innocent person. And then you add color to that and you don't have any chance at all. But that notion and the importance of understanding why that's true, the power of people who make those laws for their own good and then make sure that they're enforced unfairly, is, an essential struggle. And it's behind so much of the struggle in this country is to make the law free. Because you really can't call yourself a democratic society if you can't do that. One of the portraits that's over at the gallery is somebody who's a great friend of Bill McKibben's. It's Wendell Berry in an earlier incarnation. By the way, I don't know if it's still available on YouTube, but that conversation the two of you had, I think you were in Kentucky. There's a conversation between Wendell and Bill that you can watch on the internet. If you haven't seen it, watch it. I just want to say something about law and about this man. The quote that I put on his painting is from an essay he wrote in 1991, right at the end of the first Gulf War. And he said, the most alarming sign, wait a minute, let me just read this again. The most alarming sign of the state of our society today is that our leaders have the courage to sacrifice the lives of young people in war, but do not have the courage to tell us to be less greedy and less wasteful. I go into a lot of high schools and have kids analyze that quote. What's he talking about? What are those two kinds of courage? Why is it that if you have, why is it that leaders would have the courage to sacrifice the lives of young people, but not this other kind of courage that seems so simple? And kids talk about it, and they finally get it that, if you run an economy on waste and greed, it becomes the most essential thing in your society, and the lives of your own children become secondary. They become the collateral damage for your economy. This is really important. I mean, those kids in Florida are realizing this right now. How this works and the way it plays out and the primacy of economy over life. We live in a society that has decided to build its ethics based on economy rather than on morality. And, when you start to do that, this is what you do. You don't care about your own children. Another quote that I use a lot with kids is the one from Marian Wright Edelman, where she says, "What's wrong with our children?" And then she's asking rhetorically. And then she says, "Well, it's adults telling children to be honest while they are lying and cheating. It's adults telling children to be nonviolent while they're marketing and glorifying violence. I believe adult hypocrisy is the biggest problem that children face in America." I've never been in a high school class where anywhere in this country, anywhere, where kids have said, "Oh, that's not true." Never, seriously. And it's another aspect of what Wendell Berry is talking about. But that, those problems, that what we do, in the name of progress when we mean economy and profit, and what we then justify taking away from people is, makes the work of what we all do, both very hard but also incredibly important, because we're really struggling to, build a society that's based on real values and not just, money's values. I want to mention just one other person. I probably don't have much time, but I recently painted Brian Stevenson. Some of you know who he is? I'm sure you do. He's a black lawyer who started the Equal Justice Initiative in Montgomery, Alabama. This year, he's opening a museum that's going to, with the title of From Slavery to Mass Incarceration, telling the history of racism in this country and the mechanisms and systems of it. And he's been doing this thing for years now, where he's been actually going around to the 4,000 plus sites in the South, where, not only the South, where black men and women were lynched, and putting up historical markers. But the Equal Justice Society is built, or initiative, is built very much around the prison system and trying to get an end to capital punishment, and by both legal means and also the morality of it. I mean, 1 out of 4 people in death row in this country is not guilty. So it's like playing Russian roulette when we execute people. But he's also changing the laws. He's been numerous times to the Supreme Court trying to change the laws about how we punish children. Because so many of the children who are do crimes that are the kind of same thing that an adult might do are given much harsher sentences, often without parole, where adults get out in 10 years or 15 years or something. Kids don't, and then they're kept in adult prisons. And what happens to them is horrendous. But anyway, this man is really, really doing a great job. And if you don't know about him and you want to know more, read his book, Just Mercy, which came out a couple years ago. It's a brilliant book. One of the things, and this is also at the core of the kind of work we all do, and Chris and I were talking about this, I think it was this morning or last night, about an essential job of, doing work based around social, economic, or environmental justice is how do you change the narrative? How do you get people thinking differently? Giving themselves permission to think differently, because that's really kind of what it amounts to. And Brian Stevenson is working very hard on that question in terms of racism, because he says, what happened, that slavery ended. We did do that. But what didn't end were all the justifications for why we had slavery in the first place. The attitudes that were ingrained in people to justify slavery, those didn't end. How do you get those out of a culture? And it's that kind of work, whether we're talking about how we exploit the environment, what we've done to Native people in this country, how we justify that. It's still justified. That is the real nut of this so much. The hardest work often is around strategizing about how you change those narratives so that people see the problem differently. I mean, look at the gun issue right now. Changing that narrative. When on the one hand, it's so obvious, that, well, the countries that don't have guns don't do this stuff. And so maybe there's a solution there. But how do you actually change that narrative about the right to my gun, and it's going to protect me and from other people and the government and all the different reasons that are given? It's a tough one. Anyways, so I have 235 paintings. I showed you 2, I think. What this enables me to do, basically, and this is my effort at changing those narratives, is using these portraits, because when I do get into schools, I tell stories. I mean, I've got the paintings, but each painting has a story about who this person is, what they've done, how they've exhibited a kind of persistent courage to change an issue. Kids get that, They love, well, all of us do. We all love those stories, stories of courage. They inspire us. And then hopefully they encourage, people to act like that. In the, I don't know how many of you saw the little article that was in the Valley News. There was something in there I didn't say, which was kind of embarrassing. I was mentioning that I said I don't paint saints. I mean, excuse me, I don't paint saints. I said I paint real people. And I was saying that that's the good news, if they were saints, none of us could emulate them. But, these are real people. These are as deeply flawed as the rest of us. And they said that I make a practice of painting deeply flawed people. I hope you didn't see the article. Luckily, we have a couple of very deeply flawed people here to speak tonight. So deeply flawed that you could base the rest of your life on what they do and you'd be a great person. Who's next? Bill. Bill McKibben.
Well, Robert, thank you so much, and thank you for all your work for so long. I got to say, it's a little. Robert painted my portrait quite a while ago, which means that it's somewhat unnerving to see what one looked like quite a while ago. It's a pleasure to be at VLS. Demir's, thank you for having us. It's always good to be at this place, and especially now when it takes a certain amount of optimism in our country. I mean, sort of be in law school at the moment is to believe that we're actually going to have a working legal system that matters in our democracy in the years ahead, and it's our job to make sure that that is true. And it's not as self-evident as it's been for all of our lives that it's going to be true. What's really fun for me always with Robert's portraits is to look at the people that I know, and I know so many of them. I was just looking at the ones that you had up there on the thing. I didn't even know that you'd ever done a portrait of Ed Abbey. um, deeply flawed but extremely interesting human being, and an old friend of mine his great book, Desert Solitaire, came out 50 years ago yesterday, and worth, well, it's worth rereading and going back to look at. And it made me think, since it was art that directly connected to activism, out of it came the kind of radical wing of the environmental movement, out of it and out of his novel, The Monkey Wrench Gang. I thought I'd talk for just a couple of minutes. I'll read something maybe in a minute, but I thought I'd talk really about the role of, the importance of art in the activist work that we do. I wrote, probably 15 years ago, a piece lamenting the fact that there was no art around climate change, that no one had yet written operas, movies, whatever. And that's happily changed since then. I think the reason that they hadn't really was because it was the first time that we had a problem on this planet where the biggest focus was not the interplay between humans, but the interplay between humans and the world around us. And most of our traditions of literature and art and everything else are set up to deal with those, what had always been the kind of classic conflicts between people. But happily, since then, it's changed. In fact, having written that piece, every bad poet in America then emailed me their poem about climate change. So I can testify that there actually is a good deal of this art now being made. And now it really has reached, there's all kinds of, and it's very important. It's also very important for those of us who are also activists to figure out how to incorporate art in the work that we do. When we started 350.org, which is now a decade old, we started it, myself and 7 students over at Middlebury. One of the things that I said from the very beginning was I thought it was extremely important that we figure out how to make art and music key parts of what we did. Environmentalists, I mean, we're very science-based, we take our name from a scientific data point, but environmentalists in particular have been much better at reaching the part of the human brain that likes bar graphs and pie charts than whatever the hemisphere is, I always forget which is which, that deals with, things more visceral and closer to the heart, the kind of work, among other things, that Sherri has done, really thought deeply about. And I hadn't thought deeply about it, but I knew that that was sort of part of what we needed to be doing. And so from the very beginning, we've sort of tried to work hard in that direction. One of the very first, even when there were only 8 of us, one of the people on the staff was an artist in residence, and that position's occupied now by a wonderful guy named David Solnit, whose sister Rebecca is the great essayist of our time, and David is a great sort of movement artist that there is. And so we've done, when we've now graduated to the point of doing these big, hundreds of thousands of people at a time, marches and things, one of the first things that we do 3-4 months before they happen is find a warehouse in whatever city we're in and take it over and turn it into an art space and just start churning out the images that then will kind of come to demarcate and mark people's sense of the experience and bring in everyone from the community and set them to work on floats and banners and whatever else. Because those things are truly important in building, in helping people understand not only what the problem is, but what the kind of hope and sense of solution is. Some of you probably got out to Standing Rock for the amazing, I don't know, was anybody here able to get out to Standing Rock during the fight there? And it was spectacular on every front. Among other things, it was just so spectacularly beautiful, the place there at the confluence of the Cannonball and the Missouri rivers. But the people and everybody, and the sort of visual spectacle was magnificent. There were 300 flags from 300 different indigenous nations sort of lining the drive into, we tried to help out in all the ways we could, because these were many of our friends who were sort of spearheading this work, people that we'd worked very hard with on a lot of other things up in the tar sands and on the Keystone Pipeline work and things. And the thing that we hit on is the very first thing sort of 350 did to help out was parachute in a art workshop, set up a tent. Was one of the first things that went up there, was a kind of tent where people could be doing silk screens and banners and whatever day after day. And there were so many great native artists, and to have the kind of ability to do that. The only problem was that people were producing these incredibly beautiful things, and all the people who were visiting kept deciding they needed souvenirs of their visit, and they kept disappearing, one after another. So it was hard work just to keep up with the demand for the next day's march, the next day's sit-in, the next day's whatever. But it was beautiful to see. And so we keep doing that kind of work. David just was dispatched himself last week to go down and spend 3 or 4 weeks setting up the kind of art making process and training people, others for Reverend Barber's Poor People's March that will be launching in the next month or so, from the Carolinas. So that kind of work is extremely important, and one of the reasons maybe that it's important is that there's a natural and in some ways unavoidable tendency in the work of the kind of work that we do to be angry and confrontational, and often there's some legitimacy and importance to that, because there are plenty of things to be very angry about. But there's also, and I think all of us who do this work a lot realize the way that too much, too long anger by itself begins to kind of poison those who are engaged in it too. And there's something very powerful about art and music making us braver, and also kind of softening, opening us a little bit. I just came back from doing a program in Washington to kind of launch the next phase of our work. We did a evening program in New York in Washington, that we live streamed all over the country, and I did it with the sort of two MCs were me and my very, very good friend, Reverend Lennox Yearwood, who's the head of the Hip Hop Caucus, and someone you might someday paint, because he's a remarkable fellow. And we had the sort of special musical guest was the Howard University Gospel Choir, and I tell you, it made all the difference in a sense. They were remarkable, and they kind of set the tone, and it was good fun because we had it set up so that they opened with a really powerful number, and then it was dark, and out from the middle of them, without any introduction, emerged Bernie to give his talk. And it was a kind of great juxtaposition, because Bernie's not really a kind of gospel choir kind of guy, really, in the, and it was really something. I'll just read for a minute here from this little book of mine, because I promised I would. I normally just write very dark and depressing things, and you'll be happy to know I'm in the middle of the darkest and most depressing one yet, and it'll be out in a year or so. But last year did not seem the year for dark and depressing things. We were all completely anxious and jittery, and it's like the whole nation has just taken a dose of kind of reverse Prozac, and we're all, on edge all the time, and so it just did not seem the year for any of that. It actually seemed like it might be a good year if I was ever going to write something a little funnier, to do it. And this actually is a book that's a kind of love letter to the state of Vermont in part. I wrote much of it on the road, because I've been on the road all over the world for the last 10 or 15 years, organizing. And it's also a kind of love letter to the resistance that's springing up ever more beautifully all the time. But it's designed to be at least a little funny along the way. Humor, like art and often associated with art, is one of the things that can get lost a little bit in resistance. And that's too bad, because it's a very powerful tool, among other things, used in the right ways. But at any rate, this book is about a branch of the resistance that really doesn't like the idea of bigness at all. They're kind of rebelling against most things big, and it sort of turns into a kind of drive, the idea that Vermont might become its own nation eventually, I think. But that's sort of, it's kind of a plot device. It's bigness, really, that's the, so I'll read just a little bit from the very beginning, kind of in countenance of the fact that South Royalton is known, of course, for the best environmental law school in America, but it's also, known a little bit these days for the Worthy Burger also, and really one of the best beer taps in the entire planet. I don't know who those guys are, but they are geniuses of their trade. Beer plays a fairly large role in this book, it must be said, because beer sort of became the symbol of localism in Vermont. So this resistance is just beginning. A beer truck lumbered slowly off the Crown Point Bridge and began the drive up Route 22 toward Burlington. It hadn't gone a mile before the driver came to an orange detour sign in the middle of the road. Turned left on a dirt farm track. He drove about a mile more past cows, staring impassively at the sides of his truck with its pictures of two young women in bikinis reclining in a hot tub and hoovering Coors Light long necks with an ardor that suggested deep and full-bodied pleasure. Around a bend in the road, the truck driver found another detour sign and followed it for 2 miles till yet another sign guided him down a dirt road next to a creek lined with willows, a creek still flowing in the mild January chill. After about a mile of that, with the road turning into rut, he came upon a lady in a balaclava holding a stop sign. The driver braked, and as he did, 2 young men also in balaclavas appeared, one on either side of the truck. Each had a tire pressure gauge, and within seconds, air was hissing out of the front tires, and the trunk slumped slightly forward. "Apologies," said the lady in the balaclava. "This will take a little while, I'm afraid. If you wanted to walk to the nearest house and call the police, that's fine, but it's about 4 miles. Or you could wait a little while, and then we'll fill your tires again. Anyway, we've made you a picnic." She put a paper sack on the seat beside him and started lifting things out. "BLT with bacon from Vermont Smoke and Cure. There's a whole pint of Stratford Creamery maple walnut ice cream. And here's something special, a bottle of the new Long Trail Coffee Stout from Bridgewater Corners. You can only have one because we're serious about DUI in this state, but I think you'll find it filling. And we've got a gift pack of beers from 51 of Vermont's brewers to send home with you. Did you know that we had more breweries per capita than any place on earth? I have no idea why they think we need Coors too." While she talked, the 2 young men were busy hauling down cartons of the Coors. They opened each, quickly twisted the caps, then turned the whole box upside down to drain. When the bottles were empty, they loaded the cartons into the back of 2 pickups. The driver watched from his rearview mirror, and after about half an hour, he finally spoke. "Hey, lady," he said, "this is going to take forever. I've got 1,200 cartons in the truck. Why don't you just toss them over the side and let me go?" The woman looked up at him from above a draining carton of beer. "Oh, sweetie," she said, "this is Vermont. We recycle." The book goes on to chronicle their various adventures, and it ends, on town meeting day, which, quick public service announcement, is coming right up. So make sure you're there next Monday night or Tuesday day, depending on where you are. When they published it, the publisher called it a fable, which was fine with me because, as I said in the author's note at the end, an advantage to writing a fable is that you get to append a moral. In this case, it's not, we should all secede. Instead, it's that when confronted by small men doing big and stupid things, we need to resist with all the creativity and wit we can muster, and if we can do so without losing the civility that makes life enjoyable, then so much the better. And I think that there have been beautiful signs of this happening. The Women's March was a remarkable event. In some ways, for me, even more magnificent was the people flocking to the airports around this country in an effort to, a spontaneous effort to stop the deportation of our fellow Americans. And there'll be, I'm afraid, many more opportunities in the time ahead. Obviously, we've suffered grievous, grievous losses in the last year. And almost every one of the living people that you portraits of, I mean, they're things that they care about are being wrecked right now. I mean, sometimes literally, there's a beautiful portrait of Terry Tempest Williams across the street. She worked the last 20 years in large measure to get Grand Escalante Staircase National Monument and Bears Ears National Monument protected. And now, you know, the vandal in chief is ransacking both of them just to please the oil industry. So there are obviously huge losses underway, and we need a fierce resistance, but we need to resist in the understanding that we will eventually prevail, and so we have to be planning for that all the time, and that means, I think, being as good-humored and as civil and as full of appreciation for art and beauty and human kindness and all the things that have no currency right now among our political leaders. And if we can do that, well, then we'll see. My tendency is to be dark and pessimistic a lot of the time, but I'm willing this year to be optimistic on the grounds that what other choice is there, and on the grounds that it is wonderful to see people rising up, and in this last week to watch young people coming to the fore. You know, those millennials are so entitled that they don't even want to be massacred in their schools, you know. It's really good to see people just standing up and telling the truth as best they can. And that truth is, since that's the thing that's undergirded Robert's project all along, it's useful to see this week and many weeks how powerful that truth can be. I can't quite quote it, but it's the great once to every man and nation, Dr. King's one of his favorite hymns, the James Russell Lowell poem, in the end is truth forever on the scaffold, wrong forever on the throne, but that scaffold sways the future, and behind the dim unknown standeth God within the shadows, keeping watch above his own. Let us hope. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Bill. Hey, just be aware that I think some books will be available after tonight's presentation. Also, Robert Shetterly's exhibit just opened today over at the Bale Space, and it will be there, I think, for several weeks, Chris? End of the month, so you should check that out. Right now, let's welcome our final guest, another great truth teller from the Penobscot Indian Reservation in Maine, Sherri Mitchell.
Kwe, Guanu. Hello and welcome. Has there anybody who has ever been able to more legitimately say what a hard act to follow than me tonight? Very difficult. There are so many things that I think we all could talk about. We were kind of given some direction here, and it seems that we're not good at following rules, which is probably a good thing. Yeah, Chris is giving the thumbs up in the back. I just want to talk a little bit about what Bill mentioned about Standing Rock, because I think it's important, and there's, correlation to some of the things in my book, and I am going to do some readings and talk a little bit about some of these things. And, there was a prophecy that preceded what happened at Standing Rock. And so I don't know if you all know about this prophecy or not, but there was a prophecy by Crazy Horse, who was in ceremony a short distance from where Standing Rock emerged, and he was involved in a pipe ceremony with Sitting Bull. And at that time, he went into a vision, and somebody captured what he was saying during that entranced state, and it's been passed down. And so the prophecy says, upon suffering, beyond suffering, the red nation shall rise again, and it shall be a blessing for a sick world, a world filled with broken promises, selfishness, and separations, a world longing for light again. I see a time of 7 generations when all the colors of mankind will gather under the sacred tree of life, and the whole earth will become one circle again. In that day, there will be those among the Lakota who will carry knowledge and understanding of unity among all living things. And the young white ones will come to those of my people and ask for this wisdom. I salute the light within your eyes where the whole universe dwells. For when you are at that center within you, and I am at that place within me, we shall be as one. And what we saw happening at Standing Rock was the fruition of that prophecy. It was 1877, average lifespan, 7 generations ago. It happened a stone's throw from where the stand occurred at Standing Rock. And we saw young people from all over the world coming to Standing Rock to sit with them in a peaceful, prayerful stance against the destruction of life. And we have this warrior philosophy from our own tradition, from the Wabanaki tradition, that is called Samagnas. And I talk about it quite frequently because it's a fundamental aspect of our work right now in the world. And so we have, in my opinion, we have a formula for how we move forward, and I talk about it in the book, this 80-10-10 rule. We have to invest 10% of our time taking a long, hard look at what is wrong. We have to be able to look it in the eye. We have to be able to be honest with ourselves about it. We have to recognize not only how it's impacting us, but how it's impacting others, how it's impacting the ability of us to pass on the right to life to future generations. Then we have to do something to stop the flow of harm that's coming at us. And that's another 10%. We do that through this practice of Samagnas. That's exactly what they were doing out at Standing Rock. That warrior philosophy is about using just enough force to hold back the flow of harm without using so much force that you harm the other. And so it's based on this premise that all life is sacred and that you can't legitimately stand in protection of life if you do so with an intent to harm the lives of others. And that's what was so important about what happened at Standing Rock. You had, when I was out there, I decided that I would help supply the camp at the front end. And then I was able to go out in the winter, great time to be, in North Dakota, if you've ever wanted a vacation. I highly recommend, tenting out in North Dakota in the middle of the winter. And there were 15,000 people that were in the camp during the weekend when the Army Corps said that they weren't going to issue the permit. 15,000 people from all over the world. Tens of thousands of people cycled through the camp during the course of that stand from all over the world. And everybody watched as they were willing to put their body in harm's way for the protection of life, being completely brutalized. I mean, they were attacked by dogs, they were pepper gassed, they had water sprayed on them, water cannons sprayed on them in sub-zero temps. They were shot by rubber bullets, they were shot by concussion grenades. One young woman had her arm blown off, and still they stood prayerfully and peacefully. One of the elders that I've worked with for the past 20 years is Chief Orville Looking Horse, who is the 19th generation keeper of the sacred white buffalo calf pipe. And he is the spiritual leader for the Dakota, Lakota, and Nakota people. And Orville was there for a lot of the time. And I know that he was exhausted, Everybody that was there was exhausted. But there was this deep sense of purpose that tied everyone together and held them in place there. Because even with all of those horrific conditions, the freezing cold, the brutality of the whole thing, the difficulty in even having water that you could drink without it becoming frozen when I was there. I mean, there was challenges that were unique. All of those things were worth it, because what they recognized when they came there was that this is the way that life should be. That we should be standing together, shoulder to shoulder, from all nations, lined up in the protection of life. And it answered something for people who didn't even know what question they wanted to ask. And Standing Rock didn't end a year ago this month. Standing Rock began a year ago this month with the dismantling of that camp. Just like Rivera talks about in the Dandelion Insurrection, that they can try to, eliminate us, but we're like dandelions, the seeds go everywhere. There are now uprisings all over the country. Water warriors who are there to protect life are positioning themselves to continue that protective stance. We have a lot of problems that we need to solve. We have racial problems, we have economic problems, we have this illusion, the faux democracy that we have been participating. We have to solve all the problems associated with that. We have to solve the refugee crisis that's going on around the world as a result of our greed-based wars that we're waging. We have to do a lot of work. We will not be here to do any of that work if we do not solve the water problem. And so we have to all become water warriors. And I wanted to read something that I hadn't planned to read because we're not following the rules. And I haven't had a chance to sit down and read my book yet, but there's a few things in here that I know about. So this is a chapter called Women Are the Water Bearers of the Universe. As Skidjinuiapid, an indigenous woman, I have been taught that the women nurture life into being. We are the creators of life and the protectors of the life that we create. Women possess a unique magic. As women, we are able to call forth life from the other side and cultivate that life in the quiet space below our hearts. Within our bodies, we hold an opening to the divine, a portal that allows souls to enter into this world. Because we are connected to the divine through the space governed by our hearts, we are also the keepers of divine intuition and heart-based wisdom. Thus, the teachings that we carry are essential for keeping our societies spiritually healthy and emotionally balanced. I don't think that it's any surprise to anyone that the movement that we're seeing being created around the world, in fact, the movement that led to a lot of these really publicized uprisings amongst Indigenous people started with 5 women who started the Idle No More movement. And so looking at where we are, looking at where we've been, looking at the potential of where we could be going if we don't create change, it really heartens me to see the rising up of the women, because we need that heart-based wisdom to guide our action during this time. And so we've been having, this exploratory process through illusion for the last several centuries under these guise of separation and entitlement and superiority, which are all fallacies that we've been misled to believe. And so now we need to bring ourselves back into balance. We need to have all of the actions that we're taking out in the world guided by heart-based wisdom. And it does me a lot of a good. I've been feeling kind of sick, and I swear to God, I suddenly feel a little bit better because I heard Bill say that he's going to start operating from a more heart-based place today, and I'm going to hold him to that because, I've had some issue with some of his war language in the past, and I understand his, that we need to address these issues. And I was like, Bill, can we have a talk, about how we do that? But we can't continue to operate in the same ways that we've operated in the past. That if we simply want to conquer those who have continually conquered the hearts of our people, my people and your people, the men and the women, the children, if we want to just continue that cycle of conquest, we're not going to be any place different than the place that we're in today. There are just going to be different people speaking to you from the screen in your living room. And so if we want to truly do something different, then we have to be willing to take action that's different. We have to be willing to overcome our differences, transcend and include. That's part of that whole conscious evolutionary cycle. We don't amputate parts of ourselves as we're going through our own growth process, as we're evolving our own consciousness. We transcend and include. And so if we truly want to reach a tipping point where, change is going to be a sweeping thing, then we need to be able to make space for those who are seemingly on the other side from us to come over to the place where the heart is. And I think that that's really important. So there's another thing that I wanted to read. How am I doing on time? Okay. Well, there are 2 more things, so I'm gonna try real hard to do this. One of the things that I think is a challenge to us during this critical time is that we have been so conditioned to assign our value to some other who is supposed to solve our problems for us, right? We point at the government. Why don't they fix this? We point at our superiors at work. Why don't you fix this? We point at, the people who we believe are in positions of power, and we want them to fix the problem that we have. And so part of this evolutionary process that we're engaged in is, needing to end our childlike dependence. That it's time for us as a society to grow up and take responsibility for the world that we have co-created. And so I just want to read this little section. Another hallmark of colonization is dependence. A dependent society often feels helpless to solve its own problems. This state of dependency results in the transference of responsibility onto another. Under this system, no one is responsible for unfavorable conditions, and everyone is to blame. We have been trained through centuries of paternalistic governance to be dependent on the goodwill of the ruling class. Paternalistic rule creates a guardian-ward relationship where those in power are allowed to make decisions that override, restrict, and interfere with our freedoms based on the presumption that their actions are in our best interest. However, history has shown that the ruling class, whether their power is hereditary or electoral, almost always acts on their own behalf and often at the expense of the people they rule. This structure of governance didn't arise in a vacuum. Throughout history, the people being ruled have outnumbered the ruling class by a significant margin. At any point in time, they could have refused to be governed in this manner and demanded a more just and equitable system. But they haven't, not until now. Instead, the people have sanctioned these systems through countless common agreements and social contracts. Aside from certain indigenous models, paternalistic rule has been the predominant system of government for all of recorded history. Our long history with paternalism has created a culture of dependency where people are either unwilling or incapable of acting in their own best interest. Instead, they relinquish their power to power brokers, often to their own detriment, to avoid taking responsibility for the conditions of their lives or their societies. The culture of dependency reaches into every corner of our lives. From the day we are born, we are trained to be obedient to power and dependent on a higher authority. This training system is embedded into our government structures, education systems, employment policies, and in the tenets of most religions. And I'm skipping over to this other section here because I think it's important to recognize, the outcomes of our blind obedience to power. This type of blind obedience is dangerous in that it requires an abdication of moral authority. And we're certainly seeing the evidence of that in our society right now. Once we have accepted another as an authority figure, we are automatically conditioned to follow their lead. Operating under blind obedience to authority figures has led humanity into some of the most horrific acts in history. When we pass our power over to a paternalistic system, we release all responsibility and accountability for our lives. This gives us the ability to remain children forever, which may seem like a kind of freedom, but this is not freedom. It is a psychological prison. When we give away the power to manage our own lives, we also give away the power to change them. And so right now, what we're seeing is people rising up against that kind of power and taking charge, taking responsibility, taking action to change not only their lives, but the lives of their, brothers and sisters, the lives of their neighbors, the lives of people that they have never known before. The people who Bill talked about who fled to the airports. I had friends that I had gone to law school with who were there trying to help represent people. The people who uprooted themselves from their lives and went to Standing Rock. The people who are out in our streets marching. All of those people have decided to shrug off this cloak that they've been wearing, this illusion of separation. They've decided to let go of this mantle of oppression based on these false hierarchies of power that they've been operating under and take responsibility for creating something new in the world. And that's where we're all at right now. We have to decide what is our responsibility. We have in our cultural teachings across the board, not just the prophecy of Crazy Horse, but there's also the Rainbow Warrior prophecy. There's the Eighth Fire prophecy of the Anishinaabe people. There's, seventh generation prophecy from the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee. We have a prophecy of the reopening of the Eastern Door for Wabanaki people. And so we look at all of the things that we're seeing happening in the world. We look at the incredible figures that Rob has painted, the quotes, the warnings that they have provided to us, the guidance for times like these. And so what I want to leave you with is a question, what is our responsibility in times like these? Are we supposed to simply be keen witnesses to the unfolding of events around us, or do we have a role to play? And so I want to read you something to close here. And this is about, what are our responsibilities while living in a time of prophecy? All of the prophecies, and this is talking about this section, that are spoken of, speak of a time of awakening when the people of the earth would rise up and take the sacred teachings held in the indigenous way of life and work together to restore the health and well-being of Mother Earth. They tell us that we will face great challenges during this time, but we will succeed if we choose to walk the path that has been held for us by our ancestors. Our role is not simply to observe the emergence of these prophecies, but to actively participate in their unfolding. As we move through these challenging times, we can draw strength from knowing that we are tied to the entire lineage of life. We are loved and supported by generations of ancestors who carried these messages forward to guide us during these times. Their sacred instructions have left us with a map that can lead us back to the humanity and sacred connections that we have lost along the way. Our responsibility during this time is to seek that path and reconnect with the heart-based wisdom that binds us to one another and the rest of creation, all the way back to the beginning of time. If we honor the gift that has been left for us, we will preserve our path forward and heal the wounds of our collective past. Our legends tell us that this is not the first time we have been in this situation. According to those stories, we have been here 4 times before. 4 times we have come to this place, and 4 times we have failed to follow the messages that were given. As a result, many were required to exit the planet, and others were driven under the ground. Then we were brought back time and time again to try to correct the errors of our wayward path. Now we have been given another opportunity to correct our course. If we are successful, the prophecies tell us that we will enter into the 5th world, which will lead us back toward peace and harmony with all life. In that 5th world, we will light the 8th fire of unity and work together to heal our wounded hearts and minds. The decisions that we make today will determine whether we reach the 5th world intact or if we'll have to repeat the cycle once again. As we walk this path, we must take care to place our feet carefully, ensuring that the steps we choose are aligned with life. And at all times, we must remember that we are the dream of the ancestors come to life, the living expression of the 7th generation. We are not placeholders in time, but guardians of the future. As such, we have the responsibility for dreaming the next 7 generations into being. This dreaming is the work of our lives. It is what we were born to do. In order to complete this task, we must join our hearts and minds in a unified prayer. Then we must breathe life into a collective vision of peace, harmony, and balance, breathing into our hopes and dreams until that vision begins to take form and our future generations are able to walk into it as flesh and blood. Thank you very much.
All right, I believe we have 2 audience mics. Thank you, Becca and Chris, for having those mics available. Maybe each of you could cover each part of the room. So this evening's presentation is being live streamed and also recorded for future broadcast, rebroadcast on Royalton Community Radio, indeed Free Vermont Radio. We're part of the resistance. So what I'd like you to do, if you have a question for any of our 3 guests this evening, raise your hand. You will get a microphone, and just give your first name and the town and then who you are directing your question so that our guests will have time to come up and respond to it. Okay, questions from the audience? Here they're thinking. Comments from the audience. This is a rare treat to have these 3 special folks in the room. You could have gotten your name on the radio. Oh well. I'm sure that you might have some questions over at the book signing table, but once again, we want to thank the sponsors of tonight's gathering here of truth tellers, and they include the Vermont Law School, the New Economy Law Center, Building a Local Economy, 350 Vermont, and Free Vermont Radio. Thanks for joining us tonight.